Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of the evening. A place where the clocks seem to slow their ticking and the world outside fades into a soft and distant memory. I am curious, where in this wide world are you listening tonight? And does the air outside your window carry the scent of rain-dampened earth, or perhaps the faint sweetness of wood smoke from a neighbour's hearth? In our small sanctuary at Baker Street, the evening has been swallowed by a thick and yellow pea souper, a fog so heavy it seems to muffle the very soul of London, leaving only the ghost-like echoes of horse hooves on the distant cobblestones. Inside, the sanctuary is bathed in the warm amber glow of the firelight, which dances lazily across the brass fittings of the microscope and the worn leather of our mismatched chairs. The air is thick with the comforting, acrid scent of Holmes's strong tobacco and the subtle, dusty aroma of old parchment, while the gas lamps overhead maintain a steady, melodic hum that tethers us to the present moment. We were settled in this peaceful domesticity when a sudden, trembling knock at the door brought forth a courier who looked as though he had seen a phantom, his hands shaking as he delivered a heavy crate sealed with thick crimson wax. As Holmes carefully pried back the lid, the scent of damp cellar earth and ancient grapes filled the room, revealing a dark bottle of 1812 vintage, nestled in a bed of silvered straw. We leaned in close, the firelight reflecting in the glass, and watched in a profound and hushed curiosity as the impossible began to take shape before us. The label, which had been stained a deep, brittle saffron by the passage of 100 years, began to brighten into a pristine and snowy white, while the cork, previously shriveled and dry, smoothed its grain and became as supple as if it had been cut from the tree mere hours ago. It was a silent, graceful rebellion against the laws of the universe, a liquid piece of history deciding to drift backward toward its youth, while the rest of the world marched inexorably forward into the night. The blue flame of the Bunsen burner cast long, dancing shadows against the cluttered walls of Baker Street, illuminating the sharp, hawk-like profile of Sherlock Holmes as he leaned over his laboratory table. The room was thick with the scent of ozone and the faint, sweet tang of the strange liquid we had recovered, a scent that reminded me of crushed violets and old, forgotten libraries. Outside, the rain tapped gently against the window pane, a rhythmic, soothing sound that contrasted with the intensity of my friend's focus. Holmes did not speak for a long time, his long, thin fingers moving with a delicate precision as he transferred a single drop of the dark, iridescent fluid into a glass retort. I sat in my armchair, the warmth of the fire at my back, watching the way the gaslight caught the swirling patterns within the bottle. For the liquid did not behave as any wine I had ever seen. It seemed to possess a life of its own, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic light that defied the laws of physics. Holmes finally straightened, his eyes bright with a cold intellectual fire, and he gestured for me to approach the bench. He explained, in a voice that was barely louder than a whisper, that the substance was not a product of fermentation or any natural process known to man. It was, he said, a complex suspension of unknown catalysts, molecules that appeared to be structured in a way that suggested they were designed to interact with the very fabric of biological time. He showed me how, when a drop of the liquid was added to a piece of rusted iron, the rust seemed to dissolve not through chemical erosion, but by retreating into the metal itself, leaving the surface as polished and bright as the day it was forged. "It is not wine, Watson," he murmured, his voice trailing off into the quiet of the room. "It is a chemical echo, a distilled history that seeks to undo the work of the years." The journey to the Vane estate began in the early hours of the morning, when the city was still held in the cold grey grip of a London fog, so thick that it seemed to swallow the very sound of our horses' hooves. We sat in the hansom cab, wrapped in our heavy overcoats, the leather seats cold against our backs as we moved through the spectral streets. The gas lamps appeared as dim, golden orbs through the shifting mist, casting a ghostly glow on the wet cobblestones and the silent, shuttered fronts of the shops we passed. I could smell the damp wool of our coats, the faint aroma of Holmes's tobacco, and the pervasive, metallic scent of the fog itself, which felt heavy and wet against my skin. Holmes remained silent, his gaze fixed on the window, though there was nothing to see but the swirling grey void. He seemed to be listening to the heartbeat of the city, or perhaps to the silent ticking of the mystery that lay ahead of us. As we left the heart of London behind, the buildings grew sparse, and the air turned colder, smelling of damp earth and the rotting leaves of late autumn. The Vane estate sat at the end of a long, winding drive, lined with ancient oaks that reached out through the fog like the skeletal fingers of a giant. The house itself was a dark, brooding mass of stone and ivy, its windows like sightless eyes staring out into the gloom. There was a sense of profound isolation about the place, a feeling that we had stepped out of the world of the living and into a realm where time had ceased to hold any meaning. Upon our arrival, we were met not by a servant, but by a silence, so absolute it felt heavy in the ears. The front door, thick oak bound with tarnished brass, groaned on its hinges as Holmes pushed it open, revealing a hallway where the air was still and tasted of dust and cold lavender. We moved through the house with soft footsteps, our shadows stretching long across the faded carpets and the peeling wallpaper. There were no lights burning, and the only illumination came from the grey, filtered light of the morning through the high, narrow windows. Eventually, we found the entrance to the cellar, a heavy wooden door tucked away beneath the grand staircase. As we descended the narrow stone steps, the temperature dropped sharply, and a strange, prickling sensation began to crawl across my skin. It was not merely the cold of the underground, but an atmospheric tension that made the very air feel thick, as if we were wading through a medium denser than oxygen. My head began to throb with a dull, rhythmic ache, and I noticed that the sound of our breathing seemed to echo with a slight delay, as if the vibrations were struggling to move through the space. Holmes held his lantern high, the light reflecting off the damp walls and the rows upon rows of dusty bottles that lined the racks. This was the laboratory of Julian Vane, a place where the air was saturated with a temporal irritant that made my vision blur and my senses swim. I felt a sudden, dizzying wave of nausea as I looked at a clock on the wall. Its pendulum swung with a frantic, uneven jerk, yet the hands appeared to be moving backward, marking the passage of minutes that had already gone. In the centre of the cellar stood a heavy mahogany desk, its surface covered with a chaotic array of glass vials, copper coils, and leather-bound journals. Holmes moved toward the books with an almost predatory grace, his hands hovering over the spines before selecting a volume that was swollen with inserted notes and sketches. I stood by his side, trying to steady my breathing, which felt ragged and out of sync with my heartbeat. The air here was even thicker, smelling of scorched copper and a pungent, herbal bitterness that caught in the back of my throat. As Holmes turned the pages, I saw detailed anatomical drawings of the human heart, but they were interlaced with diagrams of celestial alignments and chemical equations that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. The journals spoke of Julian Vane's obsession, a descent into a madness fueled by the grief of a lost youth and the terrifying approach of the grave. He wrote of distilled history, a process by which the essence of a moment could be captured and concentrated, creating a serum that could force the body to relive its own past. He believed that time was not a river, but a series of overlapping circles, and that with the right catalyst, one could jump from the outer ring of old age back to the inner ring of childhood. The writing was frantic, the ink splattered and smeared, telling the story of a man who had spent decades in this sunless tomb, brewing a potion that promised immortality, but delivered only a fractured, distorted reality. "Watson, look at this," Holmes whispered, pointing to a passage where Vane described the sensory distortions we were currently experiencing. He called it the Chronos effect, a byproduct of the high concentration of the catalyst in the enclosed space. The air itself was becoming a medium for temporal instability. I felt as though I was standing in a dream, the light of the lantern seeming to fragment into a spectrum of colours that didn't exist in the natural world. I reached out to touch the stone wall, and my hand seemed to pass through a layer of shimmering air before meeting the cold, hard surface, as if the wall were half a second behind my own perception of it. The sound of a dripping pipe in the corner of the room became a deafening roar, then slowed until each drop sounded like a tolling bell, vibrating through the marrow of my bones. It was a sensory nightmare, a place where the fundamental laws of the universe had been bent and bruised by the ambition of a single, desperate chemist. Holmes, however, seemed unaffected, his mind a fortress of logic against the encroaching chaos. He continued to leaf through the journals, his eyes scanning the frantic prose for the key to the mystery, while I struggled to remain upright, the floor beneath my feet feeling as fluid as the sea. The journals revealed that Vane had not been working alone, at least not in the beginning. He spoke of a shadow, a figure he called the alchemist of the Thames, who had provided him with the initial seeds of the catalyst. This mysterious benefactor had disappeared years ago, leaving Vane to finish the work in isolation. The more I read over Holmes's shoulder, the more I realized that the wine we had found was merely a prototype, a volatile and dangerous substance that was never meant to be consumed by the living. Vane had been testing it on himself, and the journals became increasingly incoherent as the years progressed. He wrote of seeing his own younger self standing in the corners of the room, of hearing the voices of parents long dead, and of the terrifying sensation of his skin growing tight and smooth, while his mind remained trapped in the decay of 90 years. He was a man drowning in his own history, trying to catch the water in a sieve. The atmosphere in the cellar grew even more oppressive, the flickering light of the lantern casting shadows that seemed to move independently of our own bodies. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and the smell of the room changed again, becoming the metallic iron scent of fresh blood mixed with the ancient dry smell of parchment. "We must find the remaining stock," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the fog of my confusion like a blade. If this substance were to reach the streets of London, the results would be catastrophic. It is not just a poison of the body, but a poison of time itself. He began to move along the racks, tapping the bottles with a small silver hammer he took from his pocket. Most produced a dull, hollow thud, but near the back of the cellar, behind a heavy velvet curtain that was thick with dust, he found a hidden compartment. Inside were 12 bottles, identical to the one we had recovered, each glowing with that same eerie, internal light. The air in this small alcove was so thin and sharp that it burned my lungs, and the ticking of my pocket watch became a frantic, high-pitched scream. I had to lean against the cold stone of the wall to keep from falling, my vision narrowing to a small tunnel of light. Holmes carefully removed the bottles one by one, placing them into a padded leather case he had brought for the purpose. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he were handling high explosives. Every time he touched one of the bottles, a ripple of blue light would spread across the glass, and for a fleeting second, I thought I could see faces trapped within the liquid, eyes wide with a silent, eternal sorrow. As we prepared to leave the cellar, a sound echoed from the darkness of the stairs above us, a soft, shuffling noise like the dragging of a heavy coat across the floor. We froze, the lantern light shaking slightly in Holmes's hand. The air in the room suddenly felt even colder, and the sensory distortions intensified, the walls seeming to pulse in and out like the chest of a breathing animal. From the shadows of the staircase, a figure emerged, so thin and stooped, it was barely recognizable as human. This was Julian Vane, or what remained of him. His skin was unnaturally pale and translucent, stretched tight over a skeleton that seemed too large for his frame. His eyes were huge and dark, reflecting the lantern light like the eyes of a nocturnal predator, and his hair was a shock of white that drifted around his head as if he were underwater. He did not speak, but a low, guttural moan escaped his lips, a sound that carried the weight of 1,000 years of regret. He looked at us, or perhaps through us, his gaze fixed on the leather case in Holmes's hand. In that moment, The temporal irritant in the air reached a crescendo. I felt my own youth slipping away, then returning in a violent, sickening surge, my memories flashing before my eyes, like a deck of cards being shuffled by a madman. Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm and steady, a beacon of reality in the shifting dark. "Mr. Vane," he said, "your work is finished. The history you have distilled cannot be unbottled without destroying the present." The old man reached out a trembling hand, his fingers twitching in the air, as if trying to pluck the light from the lantern. He seemed to be caught in a loop of time, his body jerking through a series of motions, reaching, retreating, weeping, laughing, all within the span of a few seconds. It was a pathetic and horrifying sight, the ultimate result of a life spent trying to cheat the natural order. Holmes did not waver. He motioned for me to ascend the stairs, his eyes never leaving the tragic figure of the chemist. I climbed the steps with a sense of desperate urgency, my limbs feeling heavy and uncoordinated, the air finally thinning as I reached the hallway above. When Holmes joined me, he pulled the heavy cellar door shut and locked it with a key he had found on the desk. We stood in the silent, dusty hall of the Vane estate, the grey morning light, feeling like a benediction after the nightmare of the cellar. The sounds of the house, the settling of the wood, the wind in the chimney returned to their normal rhythms, and the crushing weight on my chest began to lift. We left the estate as the fog was beginning to lift, revealing the skeletal trees and the damp brown grass of the grounds. The journey back to London was made in a silence that was heavy with the implications of what we had discovered. The leather case sat on the floor of the cab between us, a silent passenger that held the potential to unravel the world. Holmes sat with his chin on his hands, lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the first hint of a pale, watery sun was beginning to break through the clouds. The city of London, with its noise and its crowds and its mundane ticking clocks, had never seemed so precious to me. I thought of the journals we had left behind, the records of a man who had tried to turn the clock back and found himself lost in the gears. The smell of the rain-washed air was sweet and clean, and as the clip-clop of the horses' hooves echoed through the awakening streets, I felt a profound sense of relief. We had peered into the heart of a temporal storm and emerged with our sanity intact, though I knew that the memories of that cellar, and the sight of Julian Vane, trapped in his own distilled history, would haunt my dreams for many nights to come. Back in Baker Street, the fire had burned down to a heap of glowing embers, casting a warm orange light over the familiar comforts of our rooms. Holmes placed the leather case in his reinforced safe, turning the dial with a final decisive click. He then sat in his chair, lighting his pipe, and watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling in lazy, elegant spirals. The mystery of the wine that aged in reverse was solved. Yet the questions it raised about the nature of time and the limits of human ambition remained. I picked up my pen to begin recording the events of the day, the scratch of the nib on the paper a grounding, comforting sound. The scent of old paper and tobacco filled the room, and as the clock on the mantel struck the hour, its chime was clear and steady, a reminder that time, for all its mysteries, remains the one constant we must all obey. Holmes looked over at me, a faint smile touching his lips, and for a moment the shadows of the Vane estate seemed very far away indeed. We had preserved the present, and in doing so, we had ensured that the future, with all its uncertainty and beauty, would arrive exactly when it was meant to. The fog along the Thames that evening was not a mere mist, but a heavy, velvet shroud that seemed to swallow the very sound of the lapping water against the stone embankments. We moved through the darkness like two ink stains upon a grey canvas, Holmes walking with a silent, feline grace while I adjusted the collar of my heavy wool coat against the biting dampness of the river air. The scent of salt, rotting timber, and the distant, acrid tang of coal smoke clung to our clothes, a reminder of the city's industry that continued to breathe even as the rest of the world slept. We were searching for a door that did not officially exist, a threshold into the hidden world of the Kronos syndicate, where the laws of nature were whispered to be negotiable for those with purses deep enough to pay the toll. Holmes paused near a rusted iron ring bolted into the masonry of a warehouse wall, his long, slender fingers tracing the cold metal, as if reading a language written in the oxidation and grime. He leaned closer to me, his voice a mere breath of wind, telling me that the entrance was just ahead, tucked behind a screen of discarded crates where the shadows were deepest and the river's song most mournful. As we descended the narrow, spiralling stone stairs, the temperature shifted from the biting chill of the London night to a dry, artificial warmth that smelled of aged parchment and something faintly metallic, like the ozone after a summer storm. The gallery was carved out of the very foundation of the city, a subterranean cathedral of avarice where the walls were lined with silk hangings of a deep, bruised purple. Gas lamps, turned low to a flickering amber glow, cast long, distorted shadows that danced across the faces of the gathered assembly. These were the titans of the empire, men whose names were etched in the annals of Parliament and the ledgers of the Bank of England, yet here they stood with their shoulders hunched and their eyes glittering with a desperate, pathetic hope. I watched a duke, a man I had seen in his youth leading a charge at the periphery of my military memory, now reduced to a trembling spectre of himself, his hand shaking as he clutched a silver-headed cane. They were all there for the same reason, drawn by the rumour of a vintage that defied the forward march of the clock, a wine that could supposedly turn the silver of their hair back to the gold of youth and the ache in their bones into the vigour of a spring morning. Holmes stood beside me, his profile sharp against the dim light, his eyes scanning the room not for the wine itself, but for the invisible threads that bound this grand illusion together. He nudged my elbow gently, directing my gaze toward the centre of the room where a single bottle sat atop a pedestal of black marble, illuminated by a beam of light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The liquid inside was a vibrant, impossible violet, swirling with a slow, viscous motion, as if it possessed a life of its own. It was beautiful, undeniably so. Yet as I looked closer, I noticed a faint, shimmering haze rising from the uncorked neck, a vapour that seemed to catch the light in ways that defied the simple refraction of glass. Holmes whispered into my ear, his words a soft cadence that explained how the air in this chamber was being subtly manipulated, laced with a diluted tincture of belladonna and a rare, concentrated extract of the blue poppy from the far reaches of the Orient. It was a masterpiece of suggestion, a stage set where the very air invited the mind to see what it most desired, preparing the senses for the ultimate deception that was about to be poured into their waiting glasses. The master of ceremonies stepped forward, a man of indeterminate age whose skin possessed a waxen, unnerving smoothness. His movements so controlled they felt almost mechanical. He spoke in a voice that was like honey flowing over gravel, weaving a tale of lost vineyards in the mountains of the Caucasus, where the soil was enriched by the dust of fallen stars and the grapes were harvested only during the lunar eclipse. Every word was designed to lower the defences of the weary, to bypass the intellect and speak directly to the primal fear of the grave. I felt a strange lethargy beginning to creep into my own limbs, a soft numbing of the sharp edges of the world. And I realized then the power of the syndicate's trap. They were not just selling a chemical marvel, they were selling a sanctuary from the inevitable. Holmes, however, remained a pillar of cold, analytical stone beside me, his breathing rhythmic and shallow, his mind a fortress that no hypnotic suggestion could breach. He began to point out the subtle cues, the way the auctioneer's hands moved in specific, repetitive arcs, the low-frequency hum vibrating through the floorboards, and the specific arrangement of the mirrors behind the silk hangings that focused the amber light into the pupils of the observers. As the first glass was poured for a woman of immense wealth and even greater frailty, the room fell into a silence so profound I could hear the rhythmic ticking of a pocket watch 3 rows away. She took a sip, her eyes closing in a brief moment of ecstasy, and for a second, The illusion took hold of everyone in the room. Her skin seemed to glow. Her posture straightened, and a flush of colour returned to her withered cheeks. It was a miracle performed in the dark, but Holmes leaned in to murmur the truth of the chemistry involved. He explained how the wine contained a potent blend of stimulants that would provide a temporary, violent surge of energy to the heart and nervous system, coupled with a hallucinogen that would cause the drinker to perceive their own reflection with a soft focus lens of youthful memory. It was a cruel, fleeting bloom that would leave the body more shattered than before once the chemical fire had burned itself out. The syndicate was harvesting the fortunes of these people in exchange for an hour of delusion, leaving them to wake in the cold morning with nothing but the bitter aftertaste of a dream. The bidding began not with a shout, but with the quiet, rhythmic tapping of fans and the subtle raising of gloved hands. It was a dance of shadows, each movement representing a fortune in gold, a sacrifice made at the altar of a false god. The auctioneer moved with the grace of a predator, his eyes never leaving the faces of those who offered their wealth for a taste of the violet liquid. I watched a merchant prince from the East India Company lean forward, his eyes glazed with the peculiar light of the room, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he offered more than he could possibly afford. There was a desperate hunger in the air, a spiritual famine that no amount of material success could ever hope to satisfy. Holmes watched the proceedings with a detached sadness, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his cane, his mind already formulating the steps required to dismantle this network of misery. He whispered that the sellers were not mere charlatans, but men who understood the deep, dark corridors of the human heart. Those places where the fear of the dark becomes so great that any light, no matter how false, is welcomed with open arms. In the corner of the gallery, hidden by the heavy folds of the purple silk, a small orchestra played a melody that was almost imperceptible, a low, droning sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of one's bones. Holmes explained that this was the final piece of the hypnotic puzzle, a frequency designed to synchronize with the heart rates of the listeners, making them more susceptible to the auctioneer's suggestions. It was a cold, calculating use of science to exploit the most vulnerable of human emotions. The sellers stood at the edges of the room, their faces masks of professional indifference, watching the frantic bidding with the same detachment a scientist might observe the struggles of an insect in a jar. They were the architects of this subterranean nightmare, the men who had realized that there is no commodity more valuable than time, and no customer more willing to be cheated than one who is running out of it. The tension in the room rose like a physical pressure, the air becoming thick with the scent of burning wax and the heavy, sweet perfume of the violet wine. The auctioneer's voice grew more rhythmic, more commanding, weaving a web of words that promised an end to the decay of the body and the fading of the mind. I saw the Duchess take another sip, her hands no longer trembling, her face transformed by the chemical fire into a mask of hollow vitality. It was a sight that filled me with a profound sense of melancholy, for I knew that the morning would bring a reckoning that her frail frame could scarcely endure. Holmes moved slightly, his eyes fixed on the man who had just entered the room through a side door, a figure cloaked in shadows whose presence seemed to command a specific, fearful respect from the sellers. This, Holmes whispered, was the heart of the Chronos Syndicate, the mind that had orchestrated this elaborate theatre of the macabre. We watched as the mysterious figure approached the pedestal, his movements fluid and silent. He did not look at the bidders, nor did he look at the wine. His gaze was fixed on the horizon of his own ambition. He was the one who had seen the potential in the aging aristocrats of London, the one who had turned the fear of death into a lucrative enterprise. Holmes noted the way the man's eyes flickered across the room, noting every detail, every sign of weakness. He was a master of the human psyche, a man who played upon the heartstrings of his victims, as if they were the strings of a harp. The bidding reached a fever pitch, the numbers being tossed into the air like dry leaves in a storm, until finally the gavel fell with a sound like a pistol shot in the silence of the gallery. The winner, A man whose wealth was surpassed only by his proximity to the grave, stepped forward to claim his prize, his face illuminated by a terrifying, ecstatic joy. As the crowd began to disperse, drifting away like ghosts into the velvet shadows, Holmes and I remained for a moment, observing the remnants of the spectacle. The air was still thick with the residue of the hallucinogens, and for a fleeting second, the room seemed to shift and shimmer as if it were made of water. Holmes took a deep breath of the tainted air, his expression one of grim determination. He remarked on the ingenuity of the fraud, the way it combined chemistry, psychology, and theatre into a single, devastating weapon. It was not just a crime of theft, he said, but a crime against the very essence of humanity, a betrayal of the natural order for the sake of profit. We turned toward the stairs, leaving the subterranean gallery behind, the flickering gas lamps casting one last, long shadow against the purple silk before we emerged back into the honest, cold air of the London night. The river was still flowing, a dark, silent ribbon of silver beneath the moonlight, indifferent to the dramas played out in the depths beneath its banks. We walked along the embankment, the sound of our footsteps on the cobblestones, the only rhythm in the quiet world. Holmes stopped to light his pipe, the cherry-red glow of the tobacco reflecting in his eyes. As he looked out over the water, he spoke of the nature of time, how it is the only thing we truly possess and the only thing we can never truly keep. The syndicate had tried to sell a lie, a beautiful violet-coloured lie that promised an escape from the inevitable. But in the end, the truth would always find its way back to the surface. The victims of the auction would wake to a world that was still turning, their bodies still aging, their fortunes diminished by the price of a dream. We made our way back toward Baker Street, the fog beginning to lift in the early hours of the morning, revealing the grey, solid reality of the city. The street lamps were being extinguished one by one, the pale light of dawn beginning to touch the tops of the buildings. I felt a sense of profound exhaustion, not just from the long night, but from the weight of the secrets we had uncovered. Holmes, however, seemed energized by the pursuit, his mind already working on the evidence we would present to Scotland Yard. He remarked that the Kronos syndicate would not be easily defeated, for they traded in a currency that would never lose its value. Human hope and human fear. But as long as there were those who would fight for the truth, the shadows would never fully claim the light. When we finally reached the familiar door of 221B, the world felt steady once again. The smell of the river was replaced by the scent of Mrs. Hudson's morning tea and the familiar aroma of old books and violin resin. We climbed the stairs to our rooms, the fire in the hearth having burned down to a gentle glowing ember. Holmes sat in his armchair, his long legs stretched out toward the warmth, his eyes closing in a moment of rare repose. He did not speak of the wine or the syndicate again that morning. Instead, he watched the dust motes dancing in the first light of the sun, a silent witness to the passage of time that he, perhaps more than anyone, understood could never be reversed. The world outside began to wake, the sounds of horse hooves and distant cries filling the air, a reminder that the march of life continued, steady and relentless, through the fog and the shadows of the city we called home. The case was far from over, for the syndicate had many layers, each more intricate than the last. But for now, there was a peace in the quiet room. I sat in my own chair, the warmth of the fire seeping into my bones, and thought of the Duke and the Duchess and the merchant prince. They were still out there, caught in the web of their own desires, waiting for the next drop of false hope. But here, in the stillness of Baker Street, the truth was enough. We had seen the dark heart of the underworld, and we had returned to the light, carrying with us the knowledge that time, for all its cruelty, is the only thing that makes our lives meaningful. As I drifted into a light, restless sleep, I could hear the faint, melodic scraping of Holmes's violin, a soft, melancholy tune that seemed to echo the rhythmic flow of the river and the steady, unbreakable ticking of the clock on the mantel. The air within the hidden sanctuary of the syndicate smelled of things that had no right to exist in the year 1895. A peculiar and unsettling mixture of ozone, salt spray, and the sharp metallic tang of a chemist's workshop, all contained behind the crumbling brickwork of a common warehouse. Holmes moved with a predatory grace, his footsteps silent upon the polished floorboards that seemed to hum with a secret energy. While I followed closely behind him, my hand resting instinctively upon the cold steel of my service revolver, we had crossed the threshold of the Victorian facade into a world of gleaming brass and strange pulsing lights, where the shadows did not behave as they should, and the very atmosphere felt heavy with the weight of some forbidden knowledge. In the centre of the vast, subterranean chamber stood a glass vessel of immense proportions, a translucent monolith filled with a liquid that glowed with a faint, ghostly luminescence, casting long and distorted shadows against the walls. This was the heart of the mystery, the cradle where the wine that supposedly aged in reverse was nurtured. And as we approached, I could see tiny, iridescent particles swirling within the depths of the glass like captive stars. Holmes paused before a complex array of valves and pressure gauges, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase, his long fingers hovering over a series of glass tubes that hissed with a rhythmic, mechanical breath. He did not speak at first, but merely watched the way the light played upon the wine, his face illuminated by the pale blue glow of the algae that drifted within the liquid. "It is a masterpiece of theatricality, Watson," he whispered at last, his voice barely louder than the hum of the machinery, a siren song for the desperate and the wealthy who wish to believe that time is a ribbon that can be rewound at will. He gestured toward the swirling clouds of phosphorescence, and I saw then that the light was not coming from the wine itself, but from the microscopic organisms that thrived within it, a rare strain of deep-sea algae that fed upon the very process of decay. They call it the reverse vintage, but it is merely a symphony of oxidation and light, a clever manipulation of the senses, designed to deceive the palate and the soul alike. He moved to a small, isolated chamber at the base of the monolith, a localized vacuum where the air had been thinned to a ghostly whisper, and I watched as he adjusted a brass dial with practiced precision. Within the chamber, a single bottle of thick, darkened glass sat bathed in a concentrated beam of light, and as the pressure shifted, I saw the wine inside begin to change, the deep, murky purple of an old vintage slowly giving way to a bright, vibrant crimson. It was as if the years were being stripped away before my very eyes, the sediment dissolving into nothingness, and the clarity of youth returning to the liquid in a way that defied every law of nature I had ever known. "The secret lies not in the turning back of the clock," Holmes continued, his gaze fixed on the transforming wine, "but in the removal of the evidence of its passage, for these men have found a way to use the vacuum to draw out the bitter tannins and the dissolved gases that mark the passage of decades. By introducing the algae, they create a biological filter that consumes the byproducts of age, while the light provides a visual trickery that suggests a vitality that is no longer there. It is a brilliant deception, a scientific masquerade that uses the language of chemistry to tell a lie that the heart is all too eager to believe. For who among us would not trade a fortune for a taste of the past?" As he spoke, the heavy doors at the far end of the laboratory swung open with a groan of protest, and the shadows of the syndicate's masters fell across the floor, their silhouettes tall and menacing against the flickering gaslight of the hallway beyond. They did not come with threats or shouts, but with the cold, calculated silence of men who had seen their greatest secret laid bare. And for a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the vacuum pump and the distant drip of water from the ceiling. The struggle that followed was not one of elegant swordsmanship or gentlemanly fisticuffs, but a desperate and frantic scramble in the dark, as the leader of the syndicate, a man whose face was obscured by the deep hood of his cloak, lunged toward the main control console. He did not seek to capture us, but to destroy the evidence of his crimes. His hands moving with a frantic energy as he tore at the delicate glass tubing and smashed the pressure gauges with a heavy iron bar. A thick, acrid smoke began to rise from the machinery as the vacuum seals were broken, and the sound of shattering glass echoed through the chamber like a volley of musketry. Holmes sprang forward to intercept him, his movements a blur of motion in the dim light, and for a moment they were locked in a fierce embrace. Two shadows dancing on the edge of a precipice. The laboratory was collapsing around us, the blue glow of the algae fading as the vats were breached and the liquid spilled out across the floor in a shimmering, phosphorescent tide. The air became thick with the smell of sulfur and scorched metal, and I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my shoulder as a piece of falling debris struck me. But I did not falter, my focus entirely on the exit that Holmes had indicated with a sharp nod of his head. "We cannot stay here, Watson," he shouted over the roar of the escaping steam. "The entire structure is compromised, and the foundations are giving way." He managed to break free from the syndicate leader's grasp, just as a massive explosion rocked the chamber, a burst of orange flame that momentarily blinded me and sent a wave of heat rolling through the room. We turned and fled toward the rear of the laboratory, where a small, unassuming wooden door led to the labyrinthine depths of the London sewers, a dark and damp underworld that offered our only hope of escape. Behind us, the laboratory was consumed by a brilliant, flickering light as the chemicals reacted with the air, a final, spectacular display of the false magic that had lured so many to their ruin. The descent into the sewers was a plunge into a world of cold and dampness. The smell of the earth and the river rising up to meet us as we scrambled down a rusted iron ladder into the darkness below. The water was ankle-deep and moved with a sluggish, rhythmic pulse, reflecting the faint light of the lantern that Holmes had snatched from a wall hook during our flight. We moved quickly through the narrow brick tunnels, our shadows stretching long and distorted against the moss-covered walls, the sound of our breathing loud in the stagnant air. The transition from the high-tech marvels of the laboratory to the primal muck of the sewers was jarring, a reminder of the thin veil that separates the artifice of civilization from the raw reality of the world beneath. Holmes led the way with an uncanny sense of direction, his mind already working to piece together the fragments of the conspiracy even as we waded through the filth of the city's veins. The water dripped from the ceiling in a steady, rhythmic tap, and the distant sound of the Thames could be heard through the interconnecting pipes, a low, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. As we walked, Holmes began to speak again, his voice echoing softly through the tunnel, a calm and steady presence in the midst of the gloom. "You see, Watson, the beauty of their plan was its simplicity, for they understood that the human heart is the most easily deceived organ of all, and they used the tools of the future to sell a dream of the writing of the past. But chemistry, for all its wonders, cannot truly turn back the clock of the soul, and the wine they produced was nothing more than a hollow shell, a ghost of a vintage that had long since lost its essence. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, a trick of the light and the pressure, proving once again that while we may manipulate the matter of the world, we are all subject to the steady, unyielding march of time." We eventually emerged from a heavy iron grate near the edge of the river, the cool night air of London smelling of coal smoke and rain, a welcome relief after the suffocating atmosphere of the laboratory and the sewers. The city was quiet, the gas lamps casting a soft amber glow over the cobblestones, and for a moment we simply stood there, catching our breath as the adrenaline of the escape began to fade. Holmes looked back toward the warehouse, where a thin plume of smoke was rising into the starlit sky. His expression one of somber reflection. "The syndicate is broken, Watson, and their secrets will be buried beneath the soot and the grime of the East End, but the desire that fueled them will remain, a quiet hunger for the youth that we all lose and can never truly regain." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial that he had managed to secure before the laboratory was destroyed, the liquid inside still glowing with a faint, dying ember of blue light. "It is a beautiful lie, is it not?" he mused, holding the vial up to the moonlight so that the algae within seemed to dance one last time. To think that a few organisms and a change in pressure could convince a man that he is young again, that the mistakes of his youth can be unwritten and the bitterness of age washed away. But the truth is far more profound. For our experiences, both the sweet and the sour, are what give the vintage of our lives its true depth and character. To remove the age is to remove the story, and a life without a story is a pale and empty thing indeed. He tipped the vial over the edge of the embankment, and I watched as the glowing liquid fell into the dark waters of the Thames, a single, brilliant spark that was quickly swallowed by the current. We began the long walk back toward Baker Street, the sound of our footsteps rhythmic and steady on the wet pavement, the fog beginning to roll in from the river in soft, ethereal ribbons. The night was peaceful now, the danger behind us, and I found myself thinking of the wine and the strange, shimmering lab that had tried to defy the heavens. I thought of the way the crimson colour had returned to the bottle, and how for a fleeting moment I too had wanted to believe in the possibility of a second chance. But as I looked at Holmes, his tall frame silhouetted against the mist, his eyes always searching for the truth beneath the surface of things, I realized that there was a certain dignity in the passage of time, a quiet beauty in the way the world grows old and wise. The smell of tobacco and old paper awaited us at home, the familiar comfort of the hearth, and the tea that Mrs. Hudson would surely have left for us. The mystery of the wine that aged in reverse was solved, not by magic or by the bending of natural laws, but by the careful application of reason and the recognition of the inherent limitations of the physical world. As we reached the door of 221B, Holmes paused and looked up at the stars, his face softened by the gentle shadows of the evening. "The clock cannot be turned back, Watson," he said softly, "and perhaps that is the greatest mercy of all. For it forces us to cherish the moments we have, and to find the meaning in the years as they fade." We entered the house, the warmth of the hallway wrapping around us like a well-worn coat, and as the door clicked shut behind us, the echoes of the laboratory and the sewers faded into the quiet stillness of the night, leaving only the memory of the light that tried to outshine the sun. The fire in the sitting room was a low, glowing ember, casting a warm and flickering light over the familiar clutter of Holmes's instruments and my own modest collection of books. I sat in my chair, the ache in my shoulder a dull reminder of our ordeal, and watched as Holmes moved about the room with a restless, quiet energy, his mind already beginning to settle after the storm. He picked up his violin and drew the bow across the strings, a single, mournful note that seemed to capture the very essence of the evening, a sound that whispered of things lost and things found in the heart of the mystery. The music was slow and deliberate, a gentle tide that flowed through the room and out into the foggy streets of London, a song for the wine that was never truly young and the time that would never truly stop. In the silence that followed the final note, I realized that the true revelation was not the science of the algae or the mechanics of the vacuum, but the understanding that we are all, in our own way, vintages in the making. We are shaped by the seasons and the soil, by the storms and the sunshine, and to try and reverse that process is to deny the very thing that makes us who we are. The syndicate had tried to sell a shortcut to the past, but they had forgotten that the journey is the point, and that the sediment at the bottom of the bottle is not a flaw, but a testament to a life fully lived. Holmes settled into his own chair across from me, his eyes closed as he drifted into a peaceful contemplation, and I knew that the story was over, the fog of the reverse aging having finally cleared to reveal the steady, unchanging truth of the world. The night outside was deep and still, the city wrapped in a blanket of mist that muffled the sounds of the late-night carriages and the distant tolling of Big Ben. I felt a sense of profound peace, a quiet contentment that came from knowing that while the world may be full of deceptions and shadows, there are still those who seek the light of reason and the comfort of the truth. We had seen the wonders of a hidden laboratory and felt the cold breath of the sewers, but we had returned to the simple, honest reality of our lives, where the tea is warm and the fire is bright, and the only time that matters is the present moment. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The rhythm of Holmes's steady breathing and the crackle of the hearth lulling me toward a deep and dreamless sleep. The mystery of the wine fading like a ghost into the shadows of the room. The morning would bring new challenges and new stories, but for now, the evening was our own. A quiet corner of the world where the mist unfolded like a secret and the whispers of the past were finally laid to rest. The wine that aged in reverse was a memory, a shimmering illusion that had served to remind us of the value of the years we have left. And as I drifted off, I felt a gratitude for the steady march of the clock, for the grey in my hair and the lines on my face, and for the simple, unvarnished truth that some things are meant to grow old, and in doing so, they become more beautiful than they ever were in their youth. The laboratory was gone, the algae was lost to the river, and the syndicate was a broken dream. But the story remained, a gentle mystery told in the quiet of the night, where the world is soft and the shadows are kind, and the only thing that truly lasts is the soul. The heavy oak door of number 221B swung shut behind us, sealing away the damp, salt-touched air of the London night, and welcoming us back into the embrace of the hearth's amber glow. Here the air was thick with the comforting scents of old vellum, the lingering sweetness of cherrywood tobacco, and the faint earthy musk of the coal fire settling in the grate. Sherlock Holmes, his silhouette a sharp shadow against the flickering walls, moved with a quiet grace toward his accustomed armchair, his long fingers reaching for the familiar curves of his violin. The first note he drew from the strings was a low, resonant sigh that seemed to catch the very rhythm of the grandfather clock in the corner, a steady and deliberate pulse that mirrored the heartbeat of the house itself. As the melody unfolded, slow and rhythmic like a gentle tide, I found myself sinking into the depths of my own chair, watching the way the firelight played across the spines of our shared history. I thought then of the strange vintage we had encountered, of the unnatural lure of a youth reclaimed, and I looked upon the lines on my own hands with a newfound sense of peace. There is a quiet dignity in the slow silvering of the hair, and the gentle accumulation of years, a richness that comes only from a life allowed to ripen in its own season. The gaslight hummed a low golden song, flickering smaller and smaller until the room was bathed in a soft, velvet dusk that blurred the edges of the world. Outside, the yellow fog pressed its cheek against the window pane, a silent guardian against the restless city, while within, the rhythmic ticking and the haunting sweetness of the violin wove a tapestry of profound stillness. The embers shifted with a soft, papery hiss, and as the music drifted into a mere whisper of sound, the heavy weight of a restorative slumber began to pull at the edges of consciousness, promising a rest as deep and timeless as the shadows dancing upon the ceiling.